Welcome back to the video series for Intro to GIS at Radford University. In today's video session, we're going to be going over some of the basic components of the ArcGIS desktop suite, and we will also talk about some tips and tricks for using the software as efficiently as possible. The first thing I want to talk about is what is the difference between ArcGIS, ArcMap, and ArcView. You might have read the section in the book and been a little bit confused because a lot of people use these terms interchangeably. This is kind of just common within the field, but to go back historically, ArcView was the name for the original version of the GIS software that we'll be using. Maybe we go back 10 years. ArcMap is the name for the main component of this software suite that we will be using, and ArcGIS is the generic term for the whole suite of software. So what I want to do first today is to go to the Start menu and to look at the different components of the ArcGIS desktop suite. So we can go to the Start menu and go to All Programs, and then go click on the ArcGIS folder. And we can see that there are a bunch of different components to the ArcGIS desktop suite. Your list may look a little bit different than mine. This is because there are advanced options that you can include in your install. If you just go with the standard one, you should only have these items right here that are visible. So the main component of the software that we'll be using is ArcMap. This is where you do your map production, map creation, all of your analysis, and most of your file management and manipulation of the data. Now, with version 10, they kind of changed how the software is set up, and they included the Arc Catalog component as part of the ArcMap component as well. So these two parts of the software have been fused together to make file management a little bit simpler, but you can still access them individually. So ArcMap is the part that we use for the mapping. ArcCatalog is what we use for file management. ArcGlobe is very similar to Google Earth, where you can visualize data or create spatial presentations. And then ArcScene is primarily used for three-dimensional mapping. And we will explore all of these throughout the course as we progress. So what I want to do now is to go into ArcMap 10 and to talk about the different components within this part of the software, go over some key terms and some of the basic functionalities of the software. Now, a lot of this we've probably already covered in the very first lesson exercise that you did, but I find for new users that it's very important to go over these topics several times. Learning to use the ArcGIS software suite is kind of similar to learning how to ride a bike. The more you do it, the better you become, and you even start to develop muscle memory where you just kind of remember where things are stored and how to access things. So the more you use this, the better your skills will be. And a lot of people kind of talk about how ArcMap is buggy and difficult to use, but a lot of times it is just because the users are not experienced enough with the software. So when the software package fires up, the first thing it does is it asks us if we want to open an existing map or if we want to start using a new map. And so for the purpose of this video, we will simply click on New Map, and we will start with a blank map. Now, one thing I want you to notice before we go on is that at the bottom of this dialog box, there's a path to a default geodatabase. This is where ArcMap is going to want to store any of your outputs or any new files that you create. So a lot of times it's going to pre-populate an output path, and this output path is going to be whatever you have entered down here in this line. Now, I want you to pay attention to this word geodatabase. A geodatabase is the new file style for storing spatial information. The geodatabase has basically replaced the shapefile, which you may already be familiar with, and it is a nice, compact, storage catalog. So it's like basically a folder where all of your information is stored. And what's important about the geodatabase is that it stores all of this information in tabular format so that it's nice and compact. The file size is not very large, and if you have to send other people files, you're only sending one instead of many different files, which is how a shapefile is organized. And that's something that we'll go into more detail a little bit later. But I do want you to pay attention to this path. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and maximize my screen so that we can see the area a little bit better. So the first thing I want to talk about is the menu bar. So if we're talking in videos and I tell you to go to the menu bar, I want you to go up to the area where you have the File menu item, the Edit menu item, the View, Bookmarks, Insert, and all of these other things. It's very similar to how Word is set up or other software programs. So this is the menu bar area. To the left, over here, we have the table of contents, and this is where you add layers to your map, and you can control, turn off, and manipulate layers. This area right here is what we call the map frame. Up here is our toolbar area, and I have more toolbars turned on than you probably do. So if you want to change or customize your toolbar area, you can right-click in this area and you can turn certain tools off. You can also turn other ones on. You can kind of set it up to how you like best. Certain people like to have tools in different areas. And then if you look really closely, you'll see that there's 3 dots or 4 dots next to these toolbars. And if you click on those, it allows you to move the position of your toolbars. Some people like to have the stuff at the top. Some people like it to be floating. Others like to dock it on the bottom or on the right. You can also put it over here on the left, so it's completely up to you. Each person is going to have their own unique setup. I like to have my tools up here, but it doesn't really matter. Hopefully by now you've learned what some of these standard tools are. So here's probably my most favorite tool, which is the zoom in by rectangle. So what you do is you draw a small box over the map and it will zoom you to that particular area of interest. Okay, so we've talked about the main areas of the map. Now we're going to learn how to open up the catalog so that it's embedded within ArcMap. So if you see up here in this area, we have some, we call them shortcuts for opening up our table of contents, our catalog window, a search window, and also Arc Toolbox, which we'll go into more detail later. So sometimes these things disappear and you have to bring them back. In this area, or these shortcuts are very helpful. So for example, your table of contents might go away. Well, if you need to bring it back, you can go up here, click on your table of contents window, and it pops up. Now, just like the toolbars, you can also move your table of contents and catalog windows around the screens to kind of set it up in a way that you like the best. I like to have mine docked, so I will go ahead and fix that, shrink it, and then double click right here to dock this to the left hand side. Now the next thing I'm going to do is go up to these shortcuts again, and I'm going to fire up my catalog window. Arc Catalog is your go-to place for file management. I highly recommend that you only use Arc Catalog to manage your files. New users often want to open up Windows Explorer and try to copy and paste or delete, move, and add files into ArcMap through Windows Explorer, but this is the wrong way to do it. We'll go into more detail as to why. But what I want you to remember right now is that you should only be using Arc Catalog to manage your files. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I wanted you to pay attention to the default geodatabase. This is going to be identified as home in your Arc Catalog window. And if I click on this plus symbol, we can see that I have this default geodatabase, which is where things are going to want to be stored automatically when using the ArcGIS software. I'm going to have a lot more files in my folder than you will, because I've been doing different projects and different types of analysis. So you don't need to worry about all these different things. Just make sure that you have the default geodatabase. Now, many times you will want to add files or get access to files that are in a different location than your default geodatabase. By default, many of these paths do not show up in your catalog window. So what you need to do is you need to add a folder connection. Now for this class, I've set up several different folders that I'll access and look at for demonstrations. So one of them is the 250 folder, which I have information in. So if you need to add a path, so for example, you might want to add your C drive so that you can access all the information on your computer, you need to go click on this folder connection button, and then you will browse to a particular folder that you want to add. So say for example we have data in your documents folder. You would browse down, you would find my documents, you would click OK, and you would get a new entry in the catalog window that is a link to your documents. You can click on these plus and minus buttons to expand or to minimize different folder connections and see what's in there. And it works just like Windows Explorer, so you can right click on anything, you can copy, you can paste, you can delete, you can rename things, and you can also access the properties of those folders. So one of the most helpful clicks or actions that you can do in ArcGIS is a right click. It does a lot of things. We can right click on a folder, gain access to the properties. We can right click in the toolbar area, add tools, delete them. We can right click on a data frame, again, get the properties. We can right click in the map area and gain access to other tools. So anytime you're not exactly sure what to do, I highly recommend right clicking, and there's a good chance that what you want to do will be listed in the dialog box that pops up after a right click. Okay, now just to go over a couple of basic functionalities that we've gone over already, or you should have learned in lesson 1. The first thing you need to learn how to do is add data to ArcMap. You should already know how to do this, but I'm just going to cover it one more time. One of the ways I like to add data most of the time is through a drag and drop, because it's very easy. You can drag most things around within this ArcMap software. So if I go down into my catalog and I go down to this Census 2010 file, I can drag it over to the map area, and it will open this particular file of interest. Now, since we live in Virginia, I'm going to go over and grab this zoom by rectangle tool that we talked about, and I'm going to drag a rectangle over this area over here that's Virginia, and notice how it zooms me in to that particular extent. So it's a very handy tool. It's one of the ones I use most often. Another helpful one is the pan tool, where you can move the map up, down, left, or right. And then if you want to see the full extent of your data, you can click on the globe button, and it will take you to the full extent. Now, sometimes when beginner users start using these tools, they zoom around and move to places on the map that they don't want to. And what's nice is that you have a back and forward button that you can use to go to previous zoom levels. So that's a very helpful tool as well. Other things you've probably learned how to use are the identify tool. So you can go in and actually click on a feature on the map, and it will pop up and give you access to all the spatial information that is stored within that data. There's also a measure tool, so you can go in and measure distances or area simply by clicking on a map and dragging lines, right? There's also options to measure the area of polygons and other different types of geographic features. There's also a very helpful search tool, which is identified by these binoculars. You can search for particular features in a map, or you can also search for particular locations. So it's very helpful when you need to zoom to an area that you don't know where it is, or if you're looking for some piece of data that's stuck in a whole big long list of files. And we'll cover some of these others a little bit later. Okay, so we've looked at one way to add data to ArcMap, but there are other ways. So there's also up here the Add Data tool, and you can click on that. And very similar to how you might open a file in Microsoft Word, you just browse to your folder of interest, and you click on a file and add it to the map. Most of the time I use the drag and drop from our catalog, but sometimes I do use this Add Data dialog box because you can actually add multiple files by holding the Shift key. So if you hold the Shift key, you can select more than one file and then add all of that data to ArcMap. Now there is a third method for adding data, which involves right-clicking in the table of contents on layers and going to Add Data, which fires up the very same tool that you'll see up here on the toolbox. So one of the things I want you to begin starting to notice is that there are many different ways to do the same thing in ArcMap. So anytime you're trying to do a certain type of analysis or run a certain tool, I want you to remember that there could be more than one place to access this tool, or more than one method to actually do that particular type of analysis. Okay, now another thing I want to talk about is the ArcGIS toolbox. This is where all of the tools are located that you'll use for different types of analysis throughout this class. Just like the catalog box and the table of contents, we can move this thing around. We can double click on it and dock it to certain parts of the map. We can get rid of it and bring it back up by using the shortcut. So it's very nice. And if you click on these little plus symbols, we can minimize any of these windows and they get docked over here on the right hand side of your screen. So I want to bring catalog back up. I click that. I click the thumbnail. It goes back. Very easy. Okay, so Arc Toolbox is organized so that you have different tools grouped together by similar types of things that they do. So one of the first toolboxes that we're going to be using is the analysis tools. If you click on the plus symbol next to the analysis tools, it will expand and show you more toolboxes. So we're going to go down here and open up the proximity toolbox. This toolbox is really designed to do different types of distance-based analysis or analyses. So one tool that you can run is the buffer tool. And if you look over here on the right-hand side of the screen, it gives you some descriptions about what that tool does. So the buffer tool basically creates donuts or rings around certain types of geographic features. You can see here that there is an example of point data, which is vector typed data, and they've run a buffer operation on this point data which created donuts or rings in a set distance around those point features. It also works for lines, as you can see here, and for polygons. Now, if you don't want to see this help, you can click the Hide Help button to move that over, or you can click the Show Help button to expand it. And if you need further explanation into how these tools operate and work, you can click on the Tool Help button, and that will pop up a very detailed explanation of what that tool does and how it works. Now you have to be careful because certain tools work on certain types of data. So for example, the buffer tool will only work with vector-based information. And we can identify this by looking at the input feature option. This is input features. Features are also synonymous with vector data. So a raster can never be a feature. If it were a raster-based tool, it would say input raster data. Now there are two ways, or actually three ways, to add input files. You can, one, click the drop-down menu, which will interact with your table of contents. So you can just click on that and it will populate that field. You can also drag from your table of contents over into your input. And if you don't have any information in your table of contents, you can browse out and you can add data through a dialog box that's very similar to the Add Data dialog box up here. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's this thing called the default geodatabase, which is like a little folder or a catalog where you store all of your spatial information. I want you to notice how the output has been pre-populated to go into that default geodatabase. So many times students run tools, they don't know where the files went, they don't know where their data is saved. Well, if you didn't change your default geodatabase or you didn't browse out to save it in a different location, it will be in the default geodatabase. Now, in the academic environment, we have access to all of these different tools, but in the real world, that would be very unlikely. And that's because the ArcGIS desktop suite has different types of extensions that you need to purchase so that you can run tools and do different types of analysis. So for example, later on in this class, we'll be using some of the spatial analyst tools. If you do not turn these extensions on, you will not have access to the tools. So I want you all to right now go up to the Customize button in the menu bar and to go to Extensions, and this will give you a list of all your available extensions. For simplicity, I want you to turn everyone on now so that we don't run into that problem. If you turn them on now, it will be stored in your ArcGIS profile and you'll have access to all the tools in the ArcGIS toolbox. Now for beginner users, the toolbox can be very hard to navigate. In our labs and in our lessons, sometimes a tool will be referred to and you don't exactly know where it is stored, so you might have a hard time finding it. So one thing that's very useful for beginner users is to use the search button. You can also fire the search button by going to the shortcut area in the toolbar. And so earlier we looked at the buffer tool. Well, let's pretend that you had no idea where the buffer tool was. You could simply go in, type in buffer, run that search, and it will pop up and give us access to that tool through a hyperlink. So the search option or search functionality of ArcGIS is very helpful. Okay, the last thing I want to mention or to do interacting with the software is to talk about the two different types of views. Right now we're in something called the data view. The data view is primarily used for when you're doing map analysis, when you're running tools, analyzing the data, measuring things, manipulating data, or editing it. But a lot of times after we've done that, we need to create a map product. And to do that, we go to View and we switch to the layout view, and this gives us a page that would be representing what you might print on a piece of paper, and it allows you to access different tools that you can use to make a professional looking map. I'm not going to cover map creation basics right now. That's a topic we'll cover a little bit later, and there's a lesson designed specifically to show you how to add different cartographic elements to the layout view. So you can switch views by going to View, Data View, or View, Layout View, but there's also a shortcut down in the lower left-hand side of the screen where you can switch between views using these two buttons down here. Now, one thing I want you to also notice is that if you hover over any of these different tools, you get a hover tip that describes and explains what that tool does. So it's very helpful for beginner users who don't know what tools are. You can simply go hover over it and it gives you a description. Now before I leave ArcMap, I do want to mention one other tip that people typically run into. We're going to figure out how to not have this problem. So in the table of contents, you can reorder layers by dragging them and dropping them, which is very nice. Sometimes you want to see information in a different draw order than it was initially set up. So if you want one layer on top of the other, you can draw it and switch it. Now this functionality works really good when all of your data is coming out of the same folder, but that's not always the case. So sometimes your table of contents will switch from draw order to source order. And when you're in source order, it's nice because it tells you where that file is located, but it locks the order of your data, so you can no longer drag and drop. So if you ever get in a situation where you're trying to move data up or down and you can't, I want you to make sure that you go back and you change your table of contents to draw order, and that will take care of that problem and fix it for you. Okay, so now I'm going to minimize ArcMap, and I'm going to go into this PowerPoint and cover a few other key topics. Okay, so when you look in Arc Catalog, there are lots of pictures that help describe the data, and you become very accustomed to identifying different data types by the picture that's associated with it. So anytime you see a cylinder object, I want you to know that this is referencing a geodatabase. Anytime you see something where there are points, maybe there are polygons or there are lines. So here's polygon, here's a line. This is representing a type of vector-based information, right? And there are different types of vector information. So here we can see in the geodatabase, the vector data is called a feature class, but when it's not in a geodatabase, the data is referred to as a shapefile. Many of people swap these terms out and they use them interchangeably, but the real distinction is that shapefiles are independent of a geodatabase, and a feature class is a vector type of data that we store in a geodatabase. Similarly, you can't see in this picture, but a raster would look like a grid in our catalog. So if I open up ArcGIS really quick and I go back to catalog, I can go in here and expand rasters and editing, and you can see that I have a list of 4 different raster type files. So rasters look like grids, and all vector data looks like the geometry type that is being represented. Now, I mentioned earlier that a right click in the menu area gives you access to different toolbars. So if you right click anywhere in this area, you get access to a big long list of tools that will look very similar to ArcGIS toolbox. So lots of times there are more than one way to access a tool. You can access it through the toolbar area, or you can fire up ArcGIS toolbox. Here's a little cheat sheet for some of the standard tools. As I mentioned earlier, you do have the little help pop-ups that are displayed if you hover over a tool, but here I've gone and explained in one big graphic what some of these tools are. So you might want to print this out for a quick reference if you have a hard time remembering what it is that these tools do. Again, I mentioned if you need more help, really try those map or those hover tips. It is very helpful. So here's an example of me hovering over the table of contents to identify which button is the draw order button. Remember, if your layers cannot be reordered, switch to draw order. Now, I want to talk about something I call the magical click. The right click does most things in ArcGIS, but there are other types of shortcuts. So anytime you're in doubt, I want you to right click on that object of interest, and that will give you access to lots of different properties and lots of different options to do things. One of the most common right clicks you'll do is right clicking on a layer in the table of contents. What this does is it gives you access to all the different properties for that layer. So you might be able to change a layer name, you might be able to set a scale that you want a layer to become visible at, or you might be able to set a scale where you want it to no longer become visible. The right click also gives you access to the source tab, and you'll notice these items right here are what we refer to as tabs, and the source tab is very helpful because it tells us where our file comes from, the actual type of file that is, and it also gives us information about the projection and coordinate system. Now, coordinate systems are important because that tells us the way in which the data has been spatially recorded. And there are many different types of coordinate systems, and it's important that we know what system is being used and why, so that our data overlays correctly and we can do the correct types of measurements. And we'll go into much more detail about coordinate systems and map projections at a later date. I just want you to know this is where you can find or gain access to that information. The right click on a layer also gives you access to the symbology tab, which allows you to change how a layer looks. So symbology is a very important word in GIS, and it directly relates to how we symbolize a layer or a feature. So if you wanted to change the color of a particular line, you would click on the symbology tab, and you would click on symbol, and you would pick a different color. You could change line width, and many different things. There's also a label tab, which allows you to label features based on a field in your table. So if you clicked on the label tab and you checked label features in this layer, you would get a label that popped up. So imagine that we have a road, and within your table there's a field called road name, and you want the name of the road to pop up on top of it. You would go in, you would check label features, and labels would pop up on your map. We've already talked about ArcGIS Toolbox. I want you to simply remember that this is where most of your tools are located. You will become very comfortable with navigating the toolbox, but if you can't, there is that search option, which we talked about earlier. And then one thing I didn't mention is that some of your most basic tools are located in the geoprocessing menu bar item. So we talked about running the buffer, and if you were doing lots of buffer operations and you didn't want to open up the toolbox, you could simply go to geoprocessing and then open up your buffer tool. Okay, that's all for the tips and tricks video today. Please watch the next video that will come up, which will deal with working on Lab 2. Thank you.